Caos global.
Global chaos. Barely into the year 2026, the world appears to be in flames. The attack on Venezuela and the kidnapping of its president, Nicolás Maduro, the capture of a Russian oil tanker in international waters, the threat of Greenland's occupation, the imminent attack on Iran, the protests in the United States over the murder of an American citizen. Could we be traveling the final stretch toward World War III, this time of a nuclear nature? Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From the freezing city of Berlin, at 10 degrees below zero, we begin broadcast number 316 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us. And please remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as by subscribing. And of course, for anyone who can support us through memberships or PayPal, your help is most welcome. Also, don't forget about our brand new shiny Patreon channel, which already has more than 500 subscribers, and our social media, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. And with all that said, I present to you our top-notch, truly outstanding panel joining us tonight. First of all, Mr. Javier Martínez. Javier, my friend, welcome. How's everything going over there?
Glad to be here, with a bit more warmth in the Atlantic than you have in Berlin. So let's hope the heating and electricity are working well.
On the other side of the screen, we're joined by Adrián Zelaia from the Basque Country. Hello, dear Adrián. How's everything over there?
Hi, Ezequiel. Everything's good. I'm glad to be here with you and with Javier, whom I hadn't seen in a while.
Dear friends, I want to begin this talk, this conversation, with a small excerpt from Diosdado Cabello's words today, simply as a trigger to start this discussion, first focusing on Venezuela, and then moving on to the rest of the world. These are Cabello's words from a few hours ago.
Barbaric. Venezuela was the victim of a barbaric, treacherous attack where so far, and I say so far, there are 100 dead, 100, and a similar number of injured. The attack against our country was terrible. That's true, that's a fact. No one can cover it up. People who had nothing to do with the conflict died. Civilians, women who were at home, people who were in their houses, were struck by the impact of the extremely powerful bombs dropped on our country, in tribute to the fallen martyrs and heroes. Fallen. Members of the armed forces, Cuban brothers who were here in Venezuela, fallen police officers, comrades who were asleep in their homes and suddenly were hit by gunfire and killed. This program is dedicated to them, and perhaps in third place, to put it in order, to our brother President Nicolás Maduro.
Well, that's the situation in Venezuela. And just a few minutes ago, as a starting point, here's an interview from the American newspaper, The New York Times, just published, with President Trump. Trump presents a vision of power, limited only by his own morality. On issue after issue, the president made it clear that he would be the arbiter of any limits on authority, not international law or treaties. And among the statements quoted by the New York Times, "I don't need international law. I'm not looking to harm anyone." Let's start perhaps with Venezuela. Any of you, whoever wants to. How do you interpret this? What situation does that put us in?
Well, if you'll allow me, I'd like to start with where the Chavista army was, where the armed collectives were, where the Bolivarian militia was, where the use of Russian anti-aircraft systems was, and that prolonged popular war they had promised. This tactical success, which is not a definitive success, of the Bolivarian military operation, condemnable both legally and morally, needs to be explained. That tactical success is not only due to the U.S. Special Forces. The only explanation that comes to mind is that with such precision, there must have been a perfectly executed betrayal.
Tenía que haber una traición perfectamente ejecutada. Y los indicios
And the evidence suggests that this operation would redefine the kind of regime change the United States has always carried out in Latin American countries, and that it represents a new model of regime change for the 21st century. In contrast to the quagmires of Iraq and Afghanistan, the goal here is to control or attempt to effectively control Venezuela without paying the cost of national reconstruction. Because there is no institutional rebuilding, no disarmament of militias, no creation of new security forces. There is no occupation with thousands of soldiers for a decade, no insurgency, no power vacuum, no chaos to manage. Let's recall a piece of news I received today from AP News by Joshua Goldman, which said that Citgo, the PDVSA subsidiary in 2017, under the control of Delcy Rodriguez, donated $500,000 for the festivities of Trump 1.0's inauguration. The attempt to negotiate didn't go well afterward because Marco Rubio interfered with his fanatical anti-Latin American stance. And I would end by saying I see collaboration between the siblings Delcy and Jorge Rodriguez. Because always, and that's why I've always criticized both right-wing and left-wing populism, it's not comparable to what happened in the Dominican Republic, as many say, when dictator Rafael Trujillo was attacked, and after his assassination in 1961, this is not the same logic as the Dominican Republic coup. Back then, Trujillo's regime in the Dominican Republic was a personalist one, a regime that embodied the state itself. But the Maduro regime is something else. It's a patrimonial and populist regime. And I say patrimonial because a network of military officers, bureaucrats, and businessmen captured the state to manage it as spoils. And in quotes, it operates like a mafia. Trump's, like Maduro's. That is, once the boss is dead or removed or a change of mafia boss is negotiated, they understand each other because it's patrimonial. That is to say, a regime is not defined by the names of those who occupy it, but by whom they owe loyalty to, under what pressure they operate, and how they aim not to destroy the Bolivarian state, but to capture it. Trump's triumph has been precisely that, removing Maduro, but through negotiation. And that's my thesis, and I'll conclude by saying that these populisms and these new coups d'etat, starting in 2026, will not destroy states, but capture them. Not occupy territories, but control elites. Not build nations, and of course not install democracies, but redirect existing systems and regimes. Because Maduro's regime was not and never was revolutionary, it was mafioso. And mafioso states, the United States and the Venezuelan regime, understand each other and transfer power because they make deals among mafioso elites.
All right, your perspective is very clear, Javier. Adrian, what's your view on what happened in Venezuela? And well, naturally, what's your view on the current situation in the United States with Trump at the helm?
Well, let's see. Regarding these striking events in Venezuela, there are things we know and things we can only guess, right? Something that became apparent from the very beginning and has been confirmed over time is that the army did not react to that U.S. attack. So there's one conclusion. There was indeed some kind of agreement. The question is, what exactly was agreed upon and who made the agreement? From the start, we've tried to be cautious because, of course, spreading suspicion in a general way can be destructive and lead nowhere good, right? Especially if it's done prematurely. So at the same time, we try to be cautious. But yes, I think it's necessary to make it clear that obviously there was a deal. What we don't know, first of all, is who it affects. The first question is, was Maduro himself involved or not? Because that's on the table, even if it's surprising in this context. But that's the first question. It's clear that the army was involved, but probably the rest of the government as well. Because otherwise, the parties, let's say the United States or the Venezuelan army, wouldn't have been satisfied with Maduro's removal.
Venezolanos no se hubieran quedado contentos con el desplazamiento de Maduro. Se hubieran asegurado de hacer algo con el resto del gobierno.
They would have made sure to do something with the rest of the government. If they haven't, it's because in what was agreed upon, that rest of the government was in one way or another in agreement. We can go person by person now, but of course another issue is what was agreed upon. We've repeated over these past few days that a pact is not treason, or doesn't have to be. All nations make pacts, and you can make agreements in the interest of your country or in the interest of your system. The Chavista system, let's say, in this case, right? And that doesn't necessarily have to be treason, does it? But of course, the issue is whether there are personal interests involved. Obviously, if this was done based on personal interests, then yes, we would clearly be talking about treason. Although we would have to identify betrayal of whom? Betrayal in principle of the country. In principle of the country, or let's say of your own cause of Chavismo as an ideology. Well, we have to take into account the other side, which is a Donald Trump who has that very peculiar way of managing domestic and foreign policy, and for whom image operations consume him in a disproportionate way. That is to say, practically all his politics are a succession of image operations. And this, in this case, means that faced with that extraordinary image operation from the standpoint of his domestic image, which is going to an apparently enemy country, kidnapping the president and bringing him back to my country, this represents, in principle, an impressive image victory for a Donald Trump who might have seemed cornered after deploying an entire fleet to the coast of Venezuela. Everyone knows they can't deploy hundreds of thousands of troops on the ground for a battle whose purpose would be in doubt, and that backing down after all that deployment could be a serious political blow. Donald Trump has the midterm elections in November, and it's quite possible that for him, this is right now the most important thing. For those elections, there are groups within the electorate that are especially important, such as the Cuban or Venezuelan communities in the United States. And also, perhaps even more than those groups, there's the good relationship with the establishment, which is what allows, for example, the media to treat you one way or another. Donald Trump has always managed that relationship with the establishment through actions and image gestures that convey toughness. And from that point of view, that operation with Maduro is perfect. It's so perfect that it's compatible with there being no further commitments or concessions from Venezuela. In any other case, this would be unthinkable. But in the way Donald Trump manages politics, it's possible. That is, it's theoretically possible that the United States took Maduro and didn't secure absolutely anything else regarding Venezuela's future. And in fact, some comments about the future of Venezuela, referring to what they should do, what they must do, and if they don't, then we'll go after them, give the impression that they're starting from scratch in that regard. So, of course, the question is to what extent the rest of the Chavismo leaders actually have their hands free or not, and what do they have their hands free for? Because, of course, Venezuela now had a hopeful future insofar as they were beginning to rebuild their economy with very significant GDP growth in recent years. And above all, that rapprochement with the BRICS allowed them on one hand to have a certain counterbalance to the hegemony of the United States, but more importantly, it could give them a different institutional horizon, a horizon of stability, a horizon of a clear and rational commitment to economic development, and a new, more stable relationship between the government and the opposition. A government less entrenched in a position of resistance and a more constructive opposition. But, well, the goal of the United States may precisely be to break that future. Then we have the factor Javier mentioned earlier, the corruption factor. We're dealing with a country where the revenues from hydrocarbon exploitation are enormous, and this always carries a huge risk of corruption. And we know, because it's been verified and through the Chavista system itself, that top-level Chavista leaders have fallen as a result of massive operations involving the misappropriation of staggering sums that should have been public funds. So this allows us, let's say, to extend, not suspicion exactly, but doubt about the extent to which these kinds of mechanisms have been used by the United States with regard to certain individuals.
Con respecto a unas u otras personas. Bueno, esto no hay que afirmarlo antes de.
Well, we shouldn't assert this before knowing more, but we shouldn't rule it out either. We shouldn't rule out that we're talking about this kind of mechanism, about operations that could be influencing Venezuela's future. But of course, the key question is, are we now going to have, this would be an extreme hypothesis, a Chavismo without Maduro? Because this could even be, according to some suspicious minds, an extreme hypothesis, but a great one for Chavismo, in the sense that it's been interpreted that the Maduro phase has been, let's say, a period of decline for Chavismo. In the sense that Nicolás Maduro, well, with all his enthusiasm or apparent enthusiasm, has been, many agree, a very poor manager.
Hay una coincidencia en que ha sido un muy mal gestor, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, pues esto podría ser.
So, well, this could even be an opportunity for Chavismo itself to rebuild. But it's clear that whether or not something has been promised one way or another, we have to assume that relations with the United States, in some way and at some level, are going to be different from now on. Anyway, I was going to continue, although I think I'm going on too long, and besides, I haven't answered your second question, but oh well.
I wanted to add to what Adrian was saying. For years, Maduro's movement has legitimized itself, at least in its rhetoric, through its resistance to the United States because it was anti-imperialist. But that anti-imperialist label allowed it to be corrupt, authoritarian, or incompetent. It was a fiction that gave it internal cohesion and political backing, but that's over now. And of course, the technically perfect operation, as you rightly said, by the United States, legally and morally despicable, only seeks to undermine what the U.S. elites oppose in the development of the BRICS. And that's why today, as of now, I've learned, and I'm bringing it up for discussion, that Donald Trump has taken two small steps in his policy of corporate neocolonialism or corporate neo-feudalism. On the one hand, it has given the green light to a massive sanctions project against Russia aimed at financially strangling Moscow. The text, according to what has been said, is based on Lindsey Graham and Stephen Miller, quite the pair of neocon gems. It's a bipartisan text from both Republicans and Democrats that plans to impose 500% customs duties on countries that buy oil, gas, or uranium. Therefore, it strikes at the waterline of China, India, and Brazil. And of course, this, combined with what we're seeing regarding the seizure of ships, the oil tanker, what's it called?
¿Cómo se llama? Mariner.
Sailor. Yes, Sailor. Sailor or the Sailoress, formerly Sail 1, and 2 other ships as well. The Russian reaction, of course. The chairman of the State Duma's Committee on International Affairs, Leonid Slutsky, told TASS that it was an unquestionable violation of maritime law and UN conventions. And yes, that's all well and good, but you have to respond when you're attacked, even if it's an empty ship temporarily flying a Russian flag. It's flying a flag in international waters, and the operation was carried out jointly by the United Kingdom and the United States.
Con los Estados Unidos. Eso unido a los.
That, combined with the threats to Chinese ships because of the contracts they hold, since international contracts, even if a political regime falls, still bind states, means that China has a series of investments and agreements with Nicolás Maduro, which, logically, if we don't want to sink further into the law of the jungle, because with Donald Trump 2.0, we're heading toward the law of the jungle, and who knows where, Maybe even an international conflict. We'll have to set some limits. This great big dealer, great negotiator, who to me is less a great negotiator and more a straight-up mafioso.
Es un mafioso al estilo puro y duro.
Adrian was just presenting the issue of the objectives tied to Donald Trump's domestic politics. This pursuit of a media coup aimed at the US electorate, especially the Latino electorate in Florida. A media coup that is also, without a doubt, useful for shifting the relationship with the major US media outlets, which have so far been very opposed to Donald Trump, but sympathetic to the attack on Venezuela. That's one side of it. On the other hand, Javier was presenting the issue of internal disputes within the Bolivarian regime. Now then, leaving aside for a moment the specific issue of Venezuela, immediately after the attack and Maduro's kidnapping, Trump made striking, or to some extent novel, statements. First of all, this idea of we're going to control Venezuela. Up to now, all the attacks in Somalia, Nigeria, Syria, Yemen, or Iran basically pursued a goal, and after that were abandoned. Here, however, this notion of we're going to control Venezuela appeared in a personal, almost hands-on way. Also, immediately after that, he once again brought up the issue of Greenland as something almost taken for granted. We're going to conquer Greenland somehow for our national security. A few hours later, the United States seized an oil tanker flying the Russian flag. And finally, it also made statements about an imminent attack on Iran. Right now, there are protests in the streets of Iran. And today, for example, Trump's threat in case those protests are repressed, we're going to start an attack. We are witnessing a shift in Donald Trump's policy toward a much more blatant, much more obvious imperialism. And what, in any case, would this shift be responding to? What are the objectives? What are the differences compared to what we've seen so far? Who has the question?
Sí, yo creo que esto lo podemos enfocar desde dos puntos de vista, ¿no?
Adrian, I think we can approach this from 2 points of view. If we think of the United States as a country with normal conventional leadership, we would be linking what's happening to the national security strategy doctrine that the U.S. has just approved, which apparently fits quite well with the traditional ideas of Trumpism. That is, trying to adapt to a multipolar world in the sense that, based on the realist theories of Kissinger's later years, they cannot directly confront Russia and China. So what we have to do is, that multipolar world is coming anyway. Let's position ourselves as best we can within it. And this requires two things.
Lo mejor posible en ese mundo multipolar, y esto requiere dos cosas. Primero, la reactivación de Estados Unidos.
First, the reactivation of the United States, economic, social, and so on one hand, and second, securing the sphere of influence. And there will always be the pending question. First, what is the geographic scope they consider their sphere of influence? And second, what do they mean by sphere of influence? Well, we can view all these movements within that framework of seeing the American hemisphere, the Western hemisphere, as a sphere of influence as a whole. Right? And within that sphere of influence, we take steps to subdue governments that are not sufficiently aligned, or even to incorporate countries or territories like Greenland.
Como Groenlandia, ¿no? O territorios como Groenlandia, ¿no? Bien, y la otra forma de ver.
Well, the other way to look at this is, as always, through Trump's personality. That strategic doctrine is there. It's also part of the foundations of Trumpism. But then we have a Donald Trump whose moves we keep misinterpreting time and again, because we always read them from a short-term perspective and react based on what he wants to convey at a given moment. Because one week, he projects closeness to Russia, the next week, distance from Russia, then closeness again, and then distance again. And we always get carried away by the media context that Trump himself has created, right?
El contexto mediático que el propio Trump ha creado. Entonces, tampoco hay que descartar que en este momento.
So we also shouldn't rule out that at this moment, For internal reasons and because of his relationship with the establishment, he might be interested in projecting that image of toughness and aggressiveness. And the way he does it, not so much the strategic security goals themselves, which are what they are, but the way he conveys it, the way he acts in Venezuela, the way he presents himself, so presumptuous, so aggressive, so absurd from the standpoint of traditional diplomacy, the one who wants to take over Greenland, who wants to control or dominate Mexico, Colombia, Cuba. Well, that fits more within Donald Trump's ongoing image strategy. On the topic of Greenland, a specific reflection can be made, but what really catches my attention, thinking about what the real objectives of the United States might be in this matter, is that there could be two: mineral resources and Greenland's strategic position, which we know is indeed strategic, especially considering the competition primarily with Russia. From the standpoint that it is, in a way, the gateway from the Arctic to the Atlantic. And then, if we look at the world map from above, from the North Pole, it becomes very clear that it is, so to speak, a territory clearly situated between Russia and Canada. From a missile exchange standpoint, it's clearly a strategic location. Missiles launched from Russia's Kola Peninsula, one way or another, pass over or near Greenland. But of course, this reflects objectives that, first of all, any country in the position of the United States, or any leader, would have considered. What the United States has typically done, which is to establish bases, to reach agreements under which the necessary military bases are set up, or the necessary investments are made to gain access to mineral resources.
Hago las inversiones necesarias para hacerme con recursos minerales, ¿no? Claro, el salto de esto a me quiero hacer con Groenlandia.
Of course, the leap from this to I want to take over Greenland, which is a territory belonging to another country, an allied country, in principle, is a leap that fits perfectly within Trump's strategy, which serves him, from a media standpoint, on one hand, to project that exaggeratedly aggressive image that gives him a certain cover against the establishment. And then there's the obvious problem of an apparent direct confrontation with the European NATO powers. But even that works as a pretext for the distancing that, deep down, he's very likely seeking from the rest of NATO. More or less like he played with the budget issue, trying to drive a wedge between the different powers by saying, whoever wants to stay in NATO will have to contribute 5%, and if not, they can leave, or else we won't defend them, or else we'll leave ourselves. He's been feeding all those doubts about NATO's future with this, let's say, budgetary pretext. And now, well, maybe the Greenland issue is just another way to fuel that distancing, right?
Bien, muy interesante tu interpretación, Adrián.
Well, very interesting interpretation, Adrián. If I'm reading this correctly, for you, this moment of renewed aggressiveness in Donald Trump's politics is in line with everything that came before. Right now, we would be witnessing the ascending phase, in a way, of hostility, a show of strength. Later, with contradictory positions, he will begin to make corrections in some scenario, only to once again start another aggressive phase somewhere else. And this dynamic applies both to Russia and in relation to Europe, Latin America, and Greenland. Is my interpretation of what you said correct, Adrián? Yes, yes, yes. Good. Javier, before your remarks, I want to present two little things as a starting point for your talk today. Here's something published today.
Publicado el día de hoy, está la página de la Casa Blanca.
This is the White House page with the announcement of the United States' withdrawal from international organizations, conventions, and treaties that are contrary to the interests of the United States. This order basically determines the US exit from around 66, I don't remember exactly whether 66 or 68, international treaties and United Nations bodies, such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the United Nations Population Fund, the United Nations Democracy Fund, the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality, the Peacebuilding Commission, and the United Nations Peacebuilding Fund. the Global Counterterrorism Forum? Well, many organizations within the international institutional framework created by the United States, incidentally, since the Second World War onward.
Por cierto, desde la Segunda Guerra en adelante. Y por aquí otro elemento para el análisis.
And here's another element for analysis before Javier's intervention. Here we have Tucker Carlson, someone with first-hand knowledge of Trump's inner circle. In fact, I remember that we once presented here Tucker Carlson's preview, stating that Trump had already issued the order for the attack on Venezuela. The attack didn't begin that same day, but a few days later. And according to the Trump supporters' own explanations, bad weather supposedly delayed the start of that criminal attack against Venezuela. But the news seemed true. And here is Tucker Carlson today, with this statement in one of his talks. Everything points to us soon facing a major war. According to the journalist, Trump's enormous defense budget for 2027 is a clear sign of war preparations.
Es una clara señal de preparación bélica. Esto referido a.
This refers to the presentation of the recent defense budget from today or yesterday for next year, for the year. Yes, indeed, for next year, for 2027. No longer $1 trillion, a trillion in the Spanish notation, what in English they call a trillion, a real trillion, a million. No longer 1 trillion, but 1.5 trillion for the year 2027. Are we witnessing an acceleration or not, in your opinion? Perhaps even considering the primaries at the end of this year and Trump's need to speed up the process before what many pollsters predict will be a bad election for him and the loss of the majority, at least in one of the chambers. What's your analysis of this, Javier?
¿Qué análisis realizas, Javier, de esto?
I'll start with the final part of what you were showing from Tucker Carlson's speech. The increase in the defense budget from $1 trillion to 1.5, that is, 50% more, is no longer a defense budget, but clearly a war budget. He's framing it as a headlong rush forward in a situation that connects with the first part of what you were asking me about, the U.S. withdrawal from international organizations. That was already initiated by Trump 1.0 in his first presidency, mainly due to three things that Adrian also mentioned: the economic situation in the United States, the uncontrollable, astronomical debt, both public debt and budget deficit, and inflation they can't get under control, and above all, Trump's image strategy ahead of the midterm elections this November, and an explosion that, one way or another, will be unstoppable, even if they've torn out pages and hidden photographic evidence in the Epstein case. All this in a declining empire. When we study the comparative histories of empires, it must be said that this one is a form of corporate neocolonialism, because it's no longer the colonialism of nation-states, even though in the Anglo-Saxon world corporations have always played a fundamental role. It's a kind of corporate neo-federalism, where they push for, as we can already see, the leading power not to be one anymore, neither commercially nor economically, the United States. But militarily, they can't afford the luxury of establishing bases. As Adrian also said, the policies of the 20th century can't be applied, because in the 21st century, since the 2008 crisis, here in 2026, the United States is economically and financially weakened, with uncontrollable inflation, and they're going to attack their great rival. Their great rival is the multilateralism of the BRICS, starting with China, India, Brazil, and Russia, with those new sanctions I mentioned earlier returning to the politics of sanctions. With that, I say I'm negotiating peace, but I impose sanctions. Or in the coalition of the willing, a few days ago. The coalition of the willing. European states where Macron was playing the Petit Napoleon and saying he was going to send between 5,000, 6,000, or 8,000 men, French soldiers, to Ukraine. Curiously, Jared Kushner was in the picture, that is, Trump's son-in-law. That duplicity of these populists, who on one hand talk about the people and betray MAGA, their voters, and on the other, the desperate situation of corporate elites who see that they are already being challenged in several parts of the planet, makes what Tucker Carlson is announcing very dangerous. That these are not defense budgets, but war budgets.
Que no son presupuestos de defensa, sino son presupuestos de guerra.
Bien.
All right. Situation in the United States. In this madness of one headline after another, one media blow after another. Yesterday, agents from the so-called ICE, the government agency in charge of deporting migrants, widely criticized and rejected in many parts of the United States, at least among Democratic voters, basically caused the death of a 37-year-old woman, mother of 3, a US citizen, who was simply witnessing the situation. She was there as an observer. At one point, as she got into her car to leave, shouting broke out. Things turned chaotic, and one of the agents shot her 3 times. This is currently sparking massive protests in the United States. Today, the US Senate itself also passed a law to regulate the country's military interventions. We must remember that despite this kind of legislation, and the fact that Congress is supposedly meant to approve presidential declarations of war, in practice, it almost never takes part in those decisions, since US administrations launch military interventions without labeling them as wars. That's the mechanism. But beyond that, once again, we're witnessing part of this dispute. What is the situation, in your opinion, within the United States? How likely is it that this situation could escalate even further? Let's also remember that in the United States, people are armed, which means that any internal dispute, whether with the government or between, often, pro-Trump and anti-Trump activists, frequently leads to violent situations and, in many cases, casualties. How plausible do you think an explosion and implosion of the United States is? Maybe Adrian can go first.
Implosion. Well, let's see. That possible chaotic future of the United States has been discussed in various terms. Implosion would be one of them. Possible civil war would be another. Possible evolution toward a dictatorship has also been mentioned. Well, let's see. In a way, Javier already said something about it. The underlying issue is an imperial power in decline, not just now, but for decades. A gradual decline that for a long time it wasn't even aware of, right? You only have to look at what happens when the Soviet Union falls, at the state of triumphalism the United States finds itself in. With those early 1990s ideas that the world is ours, history is over, we have the right to break. Even then, the thread was already there, wasn't it? The international right to launch preemptive wars and so on, right? With the Wolfowitz Doctrine and so on, right? However, even then, the United States was already in an increasingly difficult situation. Since the 1970s, essentially, its economy had begun to weaken and continued to do so from that point on. The processes of steadily increasing public and private debt had already begun, and so on. Well, this process has only intensified, leading to a situation that places the United States, like Western Europe, closer and closer to the end. And of course, these are very dangerous circumstances when we're talking about a hegemonic power. The first or second, depending on how you look at it, nuclear power in the world. So how is this expected to evolve? Well, of course, as a consequence of this, internal fractures have skyrocketed. The internal political differences that had practically disappeared between the Republican and Democratic parties. Now they've flared up again. Not so much exactly between the Democratic and Republican parties, but rather between what we might call the traditional political line and Trumpism. That is, the conservative neocons, in principle, seem to be closer to the Democrats than to Trumpism, although Trump manages to win them over with these kinds of image-driven gestures, as we've seen in recent days with Lindsey Graham accompanying Trump in those aggressive speeches about other countries.
Well, the thing is that the United States... Sorry to interrupt, Adrian, just a quick clarification. I'm accompanying your words with images of the protests in Minneapolis following this case, the murder of this woman. My apologies for the interruption.
Yes, well, let's see. So within that process, due to the economic and social deterioration of the United States, political confrontation can lead to situations like these or even more complicated ones. That's clear. Now, the leap to something different, such as a possible civil war. Well, a civil war requires an armed confrontation between two sides. It's usually said that two sections of the army or two armies have to face each other for there to be a war. Otherwise, in the end, it's a confrontation between the people and the army, and the people are crushed by the army. It's often said that the case of the United States is different because there are many millions of people who have a gun at home. But of course, having a gun at home is one thing, and something very different is being even minimally organized enough to face an army with the strength of the U.S. military. So is it possible for two armed forces to form, or at least one comparable force, to reach a civil war scenario? Well, it's complicated, but not impossible. Not impossible, because we know that the intelligence services in the military are also, to some extent, divided. Within that historical and cultural clash between the two Americas, so to speak, we know that a very significant part of the military and intelligence services are positioned on each of the two sides. And is the evolution toward a dictatorship possible? Also, evidently, because we are in an increasingly difficult historical context. And regarding democracy, with a certain cynicism, as we often say, we tend to recall this phrase from time to time, that democracy, unfortunately, works when nothing important is at stake. Alternation is respected, and so on. But when something important is at stake, the deck tends to be broken. And the truth is that right now, something very important is at stake, just as there was in the 1860s, which ended in the U.S. Civil War. Since then, there have been levels of social consensus that have now been broken. And this is what leads two parts of American society to think that perhaps not so much if the other side wins an election, but if it wins repeatedly, the situation becomes intolerable for them, and therefore the deck must be reshuffled. I believe that in that context, the United States is indeed in such a position, and therefore the scenario of a possible dictatorship, a dictatorship that could be presented in one form or another, right? Through manipulation or the postponement of elections and so on, is a perfectly possible scenario, isn't it?
The perspective is crystal clear. Francisco Javier, I always call you Javier. What is the role of corporations in this decline? You always present this as corporate neocolonialism. You did an outstanding analysis of big tech back then on your show. But how does the situation appear in the context of disputes among the ruling classes, among the elites? What role do these corporations play? In what way? What do they want? What's the situation in that regard?
¿Cuál es la situación en ese sentido?
Cuando las corporaciones utilizan al Estado y superan.
When corporations use the state, surpass its power, and no longer need it to develop, we are facing a problem of systemic design. It is no longer the model of democracy once called formal, or the democracy of the bourgeois revolutions from the 18th century onward. Recently, a French scholar, Pascal Goyer, published a book with Robert Laffont titled The Impossibility of Democracy. in which he argues that policies lead to a failure of formal democracy, which is not real, but at least a liberal formal democracy. When it weakens, it does so less because of its institutions, and more because of these new agents who seize power like leeches, sucking from the state until they deliver a blow and push aside the structures of the state because they no longer serve their purposes. It's a process of neo-feudalization that benefits greatly from populism, because populism doesn't operate with policy plans or rational ideologies, but rather plays fundamentally with instincts, passions, the manipulation of language, and the creation of meta-narratives that even serve the purposes we mentioned at the beginning. It seems like the situation in Venezuela is going to change, but nothing has changed. With populism, the cheapest and crudest kind.
The
situation is that the structures of the popular classes, of the industrial classes in deindustrialized countries, as is the case for most Western countries, have little power. The working classes, even less so, because there's less industry, and everything the corporate elites have done since the 1970s or 1980s, but especially since the implosion of the 1990s, has been to move production chains abroad, fragment the working classes, and blow up the pillars of what used to be a Keynesian economic structure, with middle classes that are increasingly proletarianized and impoverished. And the elite, more and more, along with their servants, both the internal servants of these elites within the states and the servants of vassal nations acting as their lackeys, are feeding the interests of these mega-corporations. But they do not act in favor of nation-states, because nation-states are no longer the only agents, even in politics and international relations. They've been around since the 1970s, when transnational corporations were born, and they've gradually taken on significant power. Because the concentration of capital in these corporations has been undermining what I always try to defend, the T in work, which I wish were a capital T, but is becoming more and more lowercase. Hence, the proliferation of the commodification of labor relations. Hence the progressive neoliberal ideology that even the so-called progressive left has replicated in its economic policies, because they destroy economic, industrial, social, and labor relations, imposing commercial policies and commercial contracts instead of labor contracts. Or worse, the so-called fake self-employed, the idea of being a successful entrepreneur. Everyone, the entire population, is being sold the idea that everyone will become entrepreneurs, successful business owners, by joining a mega-corporation. They'll be self-employed, of course, but the power of direction and control that used to belong to an employment contract, since it's no longer an employment contract, now belongs to the company to which they provide their services as freelancers, yet they're not protected by labor law. All these social relationships that had been achieved are being fragmented, so to speak, and Adrian captured that very well in his response. While the other model existed on the other side of Europe, the Soviet Union, it was necessary to create a welfare state to prevent the rest of Europe from becoming Sovietized. Logically, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, during the 1990s, neither Europe nor the United States, which never even had a New Deal at the end of World War II under Roosevelt, but that has been diminishing more and more. And the only thing the state does is support corporations with public money or bail out banks during financial crises like the one in 2007-2008, or rescue corporations when needed, but not to save individuals, not to save populations. And that's where we are. It's a sad, how should I put it? It's a sad defeat, but as I was saying, I'm looking for Saramago's phrase, the one that said there's no definitive defeat, because there are no triumphs that last forever either. I'm saying it in my own words, but that's what José Saramago said. The only hope we have is that we accumulate defeats, but defeats are not eternal. And victories, on the other hand, don't have the advantage of being eternal either. Only the association of common interests within society would allow us to ensure the survival of large segments of the population who will increasingly find themselves driven into blatant poverty.
Yesterday, the US Armed Forces, in international waters, carried out the seizure of a Russian-flagged oil tanker. Days earlier, Chinese authorities had to react and respond to statements made by the Japanese Prime Minister, according to which Japan would eventually take military action in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. In both cases, China and Russia responded to these acts of bravado, the bravado of the United States, by seizing a Russian-flagged tanker, and that of the Japanese Prime Minister, with truly unacceptable remarks about Taiwan. However, they did not take any concrete actions regarding these matters, and, for the moment, appear to be following a course that many consider moderate. Even despite this rising phase of US hostilities, not only against Venezuela and across the American continent, but around the world. Even now, with the approval, I don't recall who mentioned it a moment ago, whether it was Javier or Adrian, Trump's approval of this plan by Lindsey Graham to once again start imposing sanctions on Russia and, well, once again, a hostile, or even more hostile policy toward Russia. Why are China and Russia reacting so moderately? Should they perhaps respond more harshly, because apparently this moderation from the US side appears as weakness? Adrian.
Well, we can analyze it from the concrete point of view of the circumstances surrounding the specific cases you mentioned. But from a general perspective, I think this has to do with time management. Above all, because from the perspective of Russia and China, of the emerging model, if you will, time is on their side. And conversely, or precisely because of that, time is working against the United States. Why? Because if the context doesn't change much, Russia and China are winning. China, in the economic sphere, continues its growth, its industrial development, its exports. The United States hasn't managed to hurt it with those tariff policies, and Russia is winning in the fundamental challenge of the war in Ukraine. As a war of attrition, it was already won a couple of years ago, but, well, this is clearly getting closer and closer. In principle, from the point of view of the war in Ukraine, which is its fundamental strategic objective, it's just a matter of time. Its strategy, then, is basically not to be dragged into provocations. And we've seen this very clearly in Russia's case. Starting in 2023, when it became clear that Russia had won the war of attrition, the Western powers adopted a strategy of provocations because, well, if Russia had won the war of attrition, the only thing they could do was escalate. That was their only option. How do they escalate? By provoking Russia so that Russia gives them the justification for that escalation. They began a series of provocations over these 2 years, and Russia has always avoided falling into the trap of provocation, precisely because what it was interested in was focusing on winning the war and not letting itself be drawn out of that context. I think that's the heart of the matter. But of course, not responding to a provocation almost guarantees that before long, another provocation will come, and then another, and then another. You can't respond like that. So we're dealing with a question of time management, because everyone knows that if those provocations reach a certain level, Russia and China will eventually have to respond more aggressively. Unless, within that time-based strategy, the situation has already reached a point, for example, where Russia has won the war in Ukraine, or China, through its economic development, has also achieved several years of progress in its defensive capabilities.
Su capacidad defensiva, pues, de X años, ¿no? Digamos, todo el mundo está pensando en que
Let's say everyone is thinking that China is going to catch up to the United States in military capability. Some say in 6 years, others in 8 or 10. Well, roughly speaking. But we're within that context. Russia and China's strategy would be to avoid, if possible, falling into provocations while advancing their plans. Precisely for that reason, the strategy of the United States and the belligerent Western countries is the opposite: to try to change the framework, to try to break the framework that is pushing them toward marginalization, that is leaving them outside global hegemony.
Dejando fuera de la hegemonía mundial, ¿no? Bueno, ya digo, como se sabe que esas provocaciones...
Well, as I said, since it's known that these provocations are escalating, there could logically come a point when Russia and China think, well, there's no choice but to respond. And as you mentioned, across the media in Russia and also in various political circles, there are increasingly frequent calls for a strong response, either against Ukraine or against the Western powers, because of the different provocations. The case of these ships perhaps has some special characteristics because, of course, an image problem had been created, and it was a situation in which either Russia or the United States would face an image problem if they backed down.
Iban a tener un problema de imagen por echarse atrás. Claro, si Estados Unidos no intervenía, estamos hablando de un...
Of course, if the United States hadn't intervened, we'd be talking about a ship that did indeed fly the Russian flag, but had broken its blockade with respect to Venezuela. So it was a situation, let's say, that had to be resolved one way or another. I have heard, though I can't confirm it, that some media outlet mentioned a conversation between Putin and Trump before the ship was boarded. This is very significant because if that's confirmed, it would be something normal within the framework of relations between Russia and the United States. Then we'd be talking about a context of frictions occurring in one area or another, but within an underlying framework of mutual respect for each other's space. Right?
De respeto del espacio respectivo.
Sorry, Javier. What's your perspective on Russia and China, on their reaction or lack of reaction?
Comparto el análisis que hace Adrián.
I agree with Adrian's analysis, but I'm seeing that nevertheless, the lines leading to direct conflict among these three powers, that is, the United States against the other two, are dangerously moving toward an inevitable direct confrontation. There's that game, as Adrian says, of the strategy of time on the part of Russia and China, in contrast to the circle of hysteria of the declining American empire, which plays very skillfully, that's what Hollywood is so developed for there, at the war of narrative and the war of image.
A la guerra del relato y a la guerra de la imagen. Entonces, en esos dos choques entre la guerra del relato y de la imagen.
So in those two clashes between the war of narrative and image and the strategy of time, we will clearly see what is wise and what would be, so to speak, worthy of granting the true Nobel Peace Prize to both powers, China and Russia, and to their leaders, not falling into the circle of hysteria of a declining empire. But of course the provocations keep growing. And it's also true that everything is being played out on an electoral basis in the United States. It's all an electoral theater. So as Biden's elections approach, and above all Trump's, as you said, Adrian, at the beginning of today's talk, Trump is the man who bets everything on image, on social media, on the various social networks, on the staged screen images.
A las imágenes de postureo de pantalla es muchas veces cuando le veo gesticular.
Many times when I see him gesturing, he gestures. If you mute the footage of Benito Mussolini and Trump, Mussolini actually gestured in a much more coherent way than Trump. Trump is like Machin's maraca on fast forward. So from that perspective, in this war of narratives and images, I'm very afraid that things are speeding up, and I'm pessimistic. I hope my pessimism is wrong, but I see the lines moving toward a direct conflict one way or another this very year.
En este mismo año.
Bien, Bien, interesante tu predicción.
All right. Interesting prediction, Javier. Here we have footage of what has happened in recent days in the town of Podoli, on the outskirts of Kupiansk, Russia, following the Ukrainian counteroffensive, through which Ukraine regained part of Kupiansk. Russia launched a reconquest of the reconquest and has already captured, for example, this town of Podoli, located in the urban area of Kupiansk. And before long, it will likely take Kupiansk as well. What analysis can or should we make of the war in Ukraine at this point? How much more will Europe get involved in this? How much longer will Zelensky and his group, his circle of followers, be able to resist the ongoing and constant Russian advances? To what extent is the United States really pulling back from this scenario, or not? What analysis should we make of this situation?
Adrián, tal vez.
Bueno, vamos a ver.
Adrian, maybe. Well, let's see. We're in a situation where the phases are advancing within a war of attrition. You know that a war of attrition means that territorial gains are not the main objective. It's understood that there'll be a secondary consequence of the relative exhaustion of each of the two sides, and this is already having very significant consequences. The territorial advances, which are now continuous along the entire front, are revealing a growing weakness in the Ukrainian army. This, as you said in Kupiansk, doesn't prevent Ukraine from achieving specific victories in certain areas, because it's always a matter of concentrating forces, right?
Porque esto es siempre cuestión de concentrar fuerzas, ¿no? Siempre en una frontera, además de en un frente.
Whenever there's a front stretching over 1,000 kilometers, it's always possible to choose a point to concentrate forces and achieve certain advances, though at an immense cost. These are operations that Ukraine has undertaken throughout the war, mainly for image-related objectives. But anyway, regardless of that, what's going to happen from now on with this war of attrition? Basically, the key factor that will likely set the pace will be the rate of collapse of the Ukrainian army. In other words, Russia's advanced strategies will probably adapt to that collapse. As the Ukrainian army collapses more rapidly, the Russian army will take advantage of that collapse to speed up its territorial deployment. In the case of Donetsk, it's clear that they are already targeting Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, which are the two key cities remaining in Donetsk. And in the case of Zaporizhia, it seems they have embarked on what some have called the long march toward Odessa. A long march that would allow them, behind Odessa's main defensive lines, to gradually advance eastward until eventually reaching Odessa. Why? Because logically, it's hard to imagine the war ending without Odessa being incorporated into Russia, whether through occupation or agreement. Or because, in the surrender agreement, capitulation, or whatever you want to call it, it's agreed that Odessa will be incorporated into Russia. Well, I think that the current situation for negotiation purposes shows that the positions are extremely far apart. And they are extremely far apart, first because the nature of a war of attrition allows the side that wants to deny the reality that Russia has already won the war to maintain a kind of image game, arguing that the positions are still more or less balanced. And this is the game being played, above all, by the European powers backing the Ukrainian government's stance of continuing the resistance. But deep down, what lies behind that position is a fierce resistance from the European establishment, both political and corporate, of Europe and the United States. A fierce resistance to accepting a Russian victory in Ukraine, which for them would be something like the end of the world. They believe it marks the turning point toward losing control of the world, and probably also losing control of Europe. And therefore, they don't want to accept that in any way. But of course, the European NATO powers don't have the military capacity to confront Russia. So their strategy, quite clearly, has been to involve the United States. Thus, the key factor in what will or will not happen still lies in the United States.
Un Estados Unidos con Trump
In other words,
parece que no
a
está
United
por
States
la
under
labor
Trump
de
doesn't
implicarse
seem willing to
en ese
get
conflicto
directly
directo con
involved in
Rusia.
that
Por tanto,
conflict
desde
against
su punto de
Russia,
vista están
and therefore the
apostando
European powers
o
are
bien
betting
a
either
algún
on
tipo de
some kind of
jugada con
move
el
involving the
establishment
American
también
establishment
norteamericano,
as
porque al
well.
final el establishment,
In
como
the
yo
end, the
digo,
corporate
es el mismo
establishment is the
el
same, both European
europeo
and
y el
American.
norteamericano, ¿no?
But in
Entonces
any
están
case,
apostando
they're
una
betting on a
jugada
move
del
by the
establishment
establishment to put
a
pressure
que
on Trump
presione
now
a Trump
or perhaps
ahora o
later,
quizás después de que
after the
finalmente
potential weakening that
tras
could
las
come with the
elecciones
November midterm
legislativas
elections,
de noviembre,
or
o
else to
bien
hold out
a
in the conflict long
aguantar el
enough for the
conflicto
political
lo
context
suficiente
in the United States
hasta
to
que
change,
el contexto
even if that
político de
means
Estados
waiting
Unidos
for the next
cambie,
presidential elections.
aunque sea esperando a las siguientes elecciones presidenciales, ¿no? Pero yo creo que la apuesta es esta.
But I
En
think that's the
realidad,
real bet.
estos conceptos
In fact,
de
those
que vamos a
ideas about
desplazar
deploying
tropas
troops, first directly,
primero
then
de una
after a
forma directa y
ceasefire,
luego
well, we
después
know
desde
that's
el fuego,
absurd.
bueno, sabemos que es un absurdo.
It makes no
No tiene
sense
ningún
when that
sentido
ceasefire hasn't even
cuando
been
todavía
agreed
no se
upon
ha
yet,
acordado
and no one
ese
knows if
alto
it
el
will even
fuego.
happen.
No se sabe si va a existir.
Russia has repeatedly said
repetidamente ha
it won't
dicho que no lo
accept it,
acepta, ¿no?
right?
Entonces,
So that talk about deploying
ese
troops after a
lenguaje de que
ceasefire,
van a desplazar
everyone knows
tropas
they're actually
después de un
thinking
alto
of
el fuego,
doing it
todo el mundo
without
sabe
one,
que están pensando
but
en
they're just
hacerlo
laying the
sin un alto
groundwork
el fuego.
for a
Pero
deployment
están
they don't
simplemente
dare carry
preparando
out,
un
as I
terreno para un
said,
desplazamiento
without the backing
que
of
no
the
se
United
atreven a hacer,
States.
ya digo, sin contar con Estados Unidos. En algún momento, digo, la clave está, por lo tanto, en
At
Estados
some
Unidos.
point, I mean, the
Hasta
key
qué
therefore
punto
lies in the United
el
States.
establishment va a ser
To what
capaz
extent the
de
establishment
forzar
will be able to
a
force
Trumpism
Trumpism, one way or
de una
another,
forma u
to
otra a
enter the
entrar en el
conflict,
conflicto,
or to
o
what extent Trumpism
qué
will have the
medida
strength and power for the
Trumpismo va a operar
establishment to
fuerza
impose
y
that
poder
strategy.
para que el establishment
I think
imponga
those are the
esa
key
estrategia. Yo creo
factors
que esas
that will
son
define the
las
future
claves
of the
que van a
conflict.
definir
To what
el
extent the
futuro del
European
conflicto,
powers will
hasta
be
qué
able to
punto
prolong it
las potencias
until
europeas van a
that
ser
date.
capaces de
Conversely, of course, Russia's
prolongar el
strategy
conflicto
will
hasta esa
be,
fecha. A la
well, I'll
inversa, por
continue my
supuesto,
war of
la
attrition, but
estrategia
I'll
del
try to
oeste
end the
va a ser,
conflict
bueno, yo
before that
continúo
context
con mi guerra
arises
desgaste
in the
y
United
intentaré
States.
terminar el conflicto antes de que se produzca ese contexto en Estados Unidos, evidentemente.
Javier, did you want to say something directly about Ukraine? Yes.
Sí, añadir una cosa solamente. Es decir, el oso
Let me add one thing. That is, the Russian bear should not trust the establishment of the Anglosphere. And when I talk about the Anglosphere, I mean the United Kingdom and the United States. Regardless of the fact that, as Adrian Zelaia has rightly commented and analyzed, the war of attrition has so far been clearly favorable to Russia. And then regarding the coalition of the willing, that is, sending troops, it's just wishful thinking for now. We must not forget the other side of the establishment, even Trump's own. That is, on the one hand, he avoids sending weapons to Ukraine in March, weapons shipments and Pentagon aid for the war in Ukraine. But on the other hand, he channels CIA funds. For what purpose? Something that I believe will keep growing as Russia continues to gain ground on the front. More and more wars are being prepared through what the West knows how to do, and does perfectly well. Wars of sabotage and terrorism. The use of sabotage and terrorism as the policy of those who don't know how to win on the battlefield. And because, of course, this is, and I'll finish with this, a defeat for NATO. Because this is not a war of Ukraine against Russia, or of Russia against Ukraine. It's a NATO-Ukraine war against Russia. And on the battlefield, it's losing. But watch out for sabotage and terrorism operations.
Bien, respecto precisamente
Well, regarding sabotage operations, terrorism, and disaster policies, I wanted to present two small things before my last question to you, focused on Europe. Here, a piece of news from today. Mercedes-Benz will become a little less German after a drastic decision about one of its most popular models. The German automaker is seeking to reduce labor and operating costs, in a context where its net profit was cut in half during the first months of 2025. Basically, according to this article, Mercedes-Benz has decided to move production of its compact A-Class, the smallest Mercedes-Benz, though still a high-end car of course, from Germany to Hungary. in order to cut costs and strengthen its competitiveness against Chinese brands.
Reforzar su competitividad frente a las marcas chinas, todo esto en el contexto de una debacle de la industria.
All this in the context of a collapse of the German automotive industry, of German industry as a whole, of European industry as a whole, and of the European economy as a whole. On the other hand, another piece of news, and I'm presenting these triggers focused on Germany, but I could just as well present them about France, Spain, or the United Kingdom. I'm simply presenting Europe's situation through Germany. Chancellor Merz, today, at a press conference regarding the situation in Berlin, around 30,000 households still without power as of today, more than 1,100 businesses since Saturday. Today is Thursday. At this moment, the temperature, well, before the start of the broadcast, 10 degrees below zero.
Bueno, antes el inicio de la transmisión, -10 bajo cero. Para mañana previsto una tormenta de nieve y...
A snowstorm is expected tomorrow, along with a record low of -12 degrees, at least for recent years. Merz's response to this was as follows. I'd like to comment on Berlin, and I thank you for your question. The federal government reacted relatively quickly after the blackout when our support was requested. We provided that support through the armed forces, but also through other aid organizations. The aid organizations, the police, and the federal armed forces did an excellent job. The fact that Berlin households could be reconnected a day earlier is a great success of this effort, a joint effort. The mayor also said so, and personally thanked me for this assistance. Well, he's the Bavarian politician, not the mayor of Berlin.
Político bávaro, no el alcalde de Berlín. Básicamente, aquí el canciller alemán Merz...
Basically, here Chancellor Merz is presenting as a success the fact that they were able to restore the power supply in the German capital after an explosion last Thursday, initially attributed to Russia, but more and more evidence is emerging that it was an explosion linked to the terrible condition of the power lines in Berlin and across Germany. From Saturday to Thursday, and here comes the celebration, we managed to get the electricity back on a day earlier than planned, a sign of the pathetic state of the current situation, of successes amid disaster. What is Europe's situation from here on out? What are the alternatives? What is the future of this so decadent Europe? Adrian, maybe you first.
Bueno, yo creo que es un hecho que es bastante...
Well, I think it's quite a clear fact, quite easy to place in the context that, as I've already mentioned in some way, a context of Europe's constant economic decline over the last, 40 years. After the crisis of the 70s, the post-war model disappeared, and we entered what has been called the neoliberal model, which has meant a constant attempt to maintain investment profits at any cost, assuming that this would be the great challenge of the economy. And yet, despite all the measures taken to weaken unions, contain wages, privatize public companies, and so on, it hasn't worked. But it hasn't worked, and for quite some time now, productivity gains have been steadily declining, leading to a situation of stagnation that has lasted nearly 20 years, with productivity growth below 1%, essentially a state of stagnation. I think we mentioned this in another program with you, Ezequiel, maybe you remember. Often compare it to what happened in the final years of the Soviet Union, when growth was slowing down. But even then, in those last years, growth was higher, noticeably higher, than what Europe has experienced over the past 20 years, right? Well, that situation has not only reached increasingly stagnant levels, but has also endured a constant rise in debt, a state of ongoing labor overexploitation, and so on. In other words, a model that doesn't work. But Europe's biggest problem is a political class that neither proposes solutions nor puts the issues on the table, and that, on the contrary, has added new problems to all this in recent years. The underlying issue is that in an economic model with an ever-decreasing capacity to create wealth, this ends up affecting everything. It obviously affects wages, And investors try to protect the profitability of their investments by diverting public resources, resources from wages and resources from social aid. And this is the problem we're facing, and the one Germany is facing as well. For a long time, people have talked about Germany's problem of underinvestment in infrastructure. And what's happening now is a clear consequence of that. Of course, looking to the future, what Europe needs is a new model. It needs a new economic model. But it's probably impossible to have a new economic model without a new political class, isn't it? Of course, it's been more than a year now since Mario Draghi put an analysis on the table, saying that, well, the situation of the European economy is disastrous. And to a large extent, it's disastrous because of us. Naturally, he's one of those responsible for what has been done in Europe in recent years, right? But of course, he was blaming a lack of investment, about which nothing has been done, a demographic collapse that didn't start now, but 40 years ago, and absolutely nothing has been done about it. Problems that we, or rather the political class, have added artificially, such as an energy policy that's sometimes chaotic and sometimes almost religious, dogmatic, taking absurd measures like cutting off first cheap Russian energy, something everyone knew was suicidal, yet that path was continued. And shortly afterward, they began taking measures regarding what was the other pillar supporting the European economy, which was the relationship with China, right? And even so, absolutely suicidal measures are being taken, right? I mean, we have a political class and probably also a corporate class, right? Which, going back a bit to what Javier was saying in this regard, or at least as I've interpreted it, right? That is, large corporations have always had a certain weight, an important weight, throughout the history of capitalism, right? But they've known how to balance their interests with the general interests within a dynamic of some degree of growth. They didn't do it to promote growth. They did it to defend their own interests. But it was a model of capitalism that was, let's say, constructive, in quotation marks. That is to say, those corporations used to sustain themselves, but that was compatible with wealth creation. However, over the last 40 years, we've entered a destructive phase of capitalism, haven't we? That is, one in which those corporations can't sustain themselves without destroying the society they live in, right? And this is also leading to a progressive entrenchment of the political class, from which, as I said, without political change, we won't get out, will we? I believe that this political change, in some way, precisely because of the increasingly chaotic context we're in, is going to happen. But until it does, it's going to be very difficult for us to start solving the problems.
Javier, your perspective on Europe, its present and its future.
Well, their current situation is very bad, both in terms of policies, which, as Adrian rightly said, are suicidal, and in terms of energy, breaking ties with Russia and cutting commercial ties with China. That has also served to implement, on the one hand, energy policies that go against the business interests of European companies, then deindustrialization policies, and so to speak, policies of irrationality regarding ecology, a rather partial and quite, because of course, they talk about environmentalists voting for war credits. How does that make sense, being an environmentalist and voting for more bombs and more war industries? Or is it that bombs don't pollute, or that wars are green? The European Union's use of green funds in Europe, not only the post-pandemic funds that were supposed to go toward public health investments, but even the green funds are labeled as eco-funds as well. That is to say, it's the prostitution of concepts, because the accumulation of capital, which began to show strain in the structure of Western capitalism during the first crisis, the one in the 1970s, was unleashed and accelerated in the crisis of, well, there were other crises in between, but especially in that of 2007-2008, combined with the pandemic experiment, and I call it a pandemic experiment as such. This has led to the fact that the acceleration of capital accumulation through financialization that had been achieved didn't even hold up during the 2007-2008 crisis. And that's why we're moving toward a war economy model, which, like previous war economy models, both the first and the second end in wars, in the First World War and in the Second World War. That's why, as Adrian was saying, it's a problem of the political class, a problem of the structures in Brussels, of the European Union. It's no longer the landscape that never quite managed to define itself as such. It was a desideratum. Certain milestones of a social Europe were achieved. It was a Europe of market freedom, but for corporations, freedom of movement, Schengen, but only up to a point. And above all, the social Europe remained just that. This has been accelerated by these policies. When I saw the German president, pathetic, shameful, and brazen, boasting about awarding himself a medal amid the disaster, an even greater disaster, of a Berlin that looks like Berlin at the time of the fall of the Nazi regime, with no power or resources. But here there hasn't been any war, there hasn't been a Russian attack. What we've had here is incompetence. And beyond incompetence, there's been a great deal of greed among these elites, bowing to interests foreign to their own nation-states and to Europe itself. In other words, a lot of corruption among these elites, and of course, business elites, that are not very combative in the face of these political classes.
The perspective of both on the matter is crystal clear. By the way, for those joining us, the demolishers, all of them delighted with both interventions because of the quality of their contributions. Two top-tier analysts, until recently part of DMP Geopolitics. I'd like to remind you of something, with a bit of self-promotion. Just 8 days ago, we started, remember, a project with the creation of our channel on Patreon. Now this channel has been growing exponentially since its launch. Demoliendo Mitos on Patreon, with already 500, almost 600 subscribers. Naturally, the paying subscribers are still far fewer for now, but many demolishers have already started a free trial and will very likely later join us with a paid subscription if we can truly build a critical mass of subscribers here, especially paying subscribers who contribute. We could very likely reactivate the DMP project here, the DMP channel here, which would mean we wouldn't just be presenting our reactions, analyses, and comments on what we can't show on YouTube. That's the idea behind this Patreon channel.
En YouTube, esa la idea de este canal en Patreon. Acá podemos presentar lo que no podemos presentar por aquí.
Here we can present what we can't show here. That's why we had the talk 2 days ago, discussed with Fernando Morrigan about Zionism. And that's also why we did our analysis of the interview given by Sergei Karaganov about the Russian nuclear doctrine and the possibility of using nuclear weapons. All things impossible to present here, we present there. But once again, my friends, this is like bait, like a hook. If you really support us in this project, it's very likely that before long, Adrian and Javier will also join us on DMP through Patreon. So, there's the promotion, the advertisement, the hook. So you could not only watch our reactions, but also all the analyses from all the DMP analysts inside. Don't miss out, please. And having said that, and 1,000 apologies for the self-promotion, only at the end, I wanted to present something fun.
Quería presentar algo simpático a menudo en el cierre de nuestras transmisiones.
Often, at the end of our broadcasts, we present something a little lighter, because otherwise we'd end up doing gloomy analyses every day. So I just wanted to show this. Footage of deer and elk in the Republic of Tatarstan, Russia, at the Wild Farm Eco Park. The images were filmed on Saturday with the owner of the park, a young woman named Serena, apparently. The main goal of the ecological complex is to increase the deer population and support the region's wildlife, with animals raised on the farm before being relocated to their natural habitat. The idea was to have a country house in the forest, bring in deer, and spend weekends here with my friends.
En el bosque, traer ciervos, pasar los fines de semana aquí con mis amigos. Actualmente más de 100 alces de Altai y 200.
Currently, more than 100 Altai elk and 200 spotted deer live in the eco-park. Over 80 specimens have already been released. And here's Anastasia. Sorry, that's this girl's name. They're wild. In fact, they don't get used to either the place or people. When we release them, they're fully adapted to survive in forests without any human presence. Well, with all this cold and Christmas just around the corner, how nice this is. We're introducing these little creatures, these beautiful elk and deer, to bring things down a bit from the heights of geopolitical conflicts. Adrian, Javier, as always, it's a pleasure, a real privilege to have you with us. If you'd like, the floor is yours for the closing remarks. Anything you want to promote, your channels, where people can follow you, any thoughts you'd like to share to wrap up. The microphone is yours. Maybe Adrian first, then Javier.
Bueno, nosotros, la forma más,
Well, the most direct way to find us is through our YouTube channel, ECAI Center. It's very easy to find, EKI with a K, Center with a C. And as a reflection, well, you said it yourself. We should try, whenever possible, to make the effort that when we have no choice but to comment on a gloomy or tragic piece of news, we try to add a positive angle, looking toward the future if possible. I believe that overall there are reasons for hope. We're at a critical moment in human history, a time when there are many worrying things, but at the same time, there are objective reasons to have great hope for the future of humanity.
Tener esperanzas enormes en ese futuro de la humanidad.
Javier.
Pues para terminar, simplemente que de momento estoy centrado.
Well, to wrap up, I'll just say that for now, I'm focused solely on sharing my appearances in different media through my account on X, formerly Twitter, which is Revoltaire62, and waiting to be able to launch a channel this year, 2026, with some colleagues, where we can not only comment on the grim news, because, unfortunately, since the beginning of this third millennium, in these 26 years we've been in it, the news hasn't exactly been encouraging, and 2026 looks even worse, but always trying to find some light amid so much darkness.
Buscando la luz en tanta oscuridad.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Excelente.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent. By the way, I just found out something new. Our moderator, the #1 powerhouse, the beloved Beatriz Pulido, is celebrating her birthday today. I didn't know that. She's always so modest that I hadn't even realized. Dear Beatriz, 1,000 thanks for always being with us. Always, always there, holding the line. #1 powerhouse. Happy birthday from all of us here. Tomorrow will be with Juan Antonio Aguilar, and on Sunday once again with Fernando Moragon. Powerhouses, we love you all very much. Until next time.
Bye-bye, regards.
¿Qué?